Good morning. Morning, I'm Nicky Campbell. Welcome to The Big Questions. We're back at Manor Church of England Academy in York to debate one very big question. Is it more rational to believe in God? Welcome, everyone, to The Big Questions this morning, and thank you very much for coming here. Now, Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French mathematician, physicist and inventor, became a Christian philosopher later in his life. He combined the mathematics of probability with religious belief in his famous wager, arguing that as you can neither prove nor disprove God's existence, you must wager. If God exists and you are a believer, you gain everything. If God does not exist, you lose nothing. So Pascal reasons that you should believe in God. So, would Pascal say the same today when the faithful are often publicly pilloried as idiots and science continues to discover rational explanations for the former mysteries of life? Is it more rational to believe in God? To debate that question, we've assembled a very distinguished lineup of philosophers, theologians, commentators, scientists, people of faith, and people who've lost faith. You can have your say via Twitter, online. Just log on to bbc.co.uk/thebigquestions, where you'll find links to continue the discussion there. There'll be lots of encouragement and contributions, of course, from our very lively York audience. Is it more rational to believe in God? So, Julian Virginie, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, there are people who say it is far more rational to believe in God than not to, and they are, you will not be surprised to hear, sitting in this studio. So why do you think, what do you say to them?
Well, I mean, I think that you've got to look at what's rational. You've got to look at what reasons give us reason to believe on balance. Now, that's why I don't think it's very helpful just to say that religious believers are irrational, so they're just stupid. There's a balance of evidence, and you've got to ask yourself, where does it lean most heavily? And I think that if you were to ask, well, what would happen if someone came into this debate without a prior knowledge, without an upbringing in one particular religion or another? And I think if they looked at the evidence, they would conclude that this is a natural universe without any supernatural guidance going on, and that the religions we have in this culture are a product of different cultures, which is why there are different religions in different societies. That's a very sort of like broad-brushed version of the argument, but it's that idea that it's just on balance. That's what seems to be where the reason points.
So that there's no natural inherent, well, needs the wrong word, but there is no God within us that means we have to believe in God or we're led to believe in God. You don't believe that?
There are, it seems to be natural instincts towards looking for like purpose and agency in the universe. So it seems to be a very natural human instinct to sort of try and find reasons for things happen, which are to do with motivations and desires. But the fact that that's something we've evolved to have doesn't actually tell us anything about whether or not there is something there actually doing that. You know, the instinct is just an instinct, which you could say evolved because we need to look to how things work. We need to understand how things work. And for other people, it's helpful to be able to see them as having motives. But that kind of general instinct, I think, when we apply it to the universe as a whole, it's misapplied because the universe isn't another person. It isn't something we need to understand the motivations of.
Okay, thank you. So that last point about how we've evolved to seek pattern and seek explanation, Professor McGrath, Science and Religion, Oxford University, we are brainy primates, aren't we? We are pattern-seeking mammals. That's what Julian is saying. Of course, we seek for an explanation. We seek an explanation, and also we seek a comfort zone, do we not?
Well, of course we're looking for explanations. I mean, that's what intelligent people do. It's about trying to work out what is going on in the world. And Julian is also right to say, look, you know, that's just part of who we are. But that doesn't deny the validity of looking for meaning. And explaining why we think something does not invalidate the quest. What I want to say is, look, I'm a scientist. I began as an atheist. I became a Christian. And for me, one of the enormously exciting things about discovering the Christian faith was not simply it helped me be a better scientist, but also it really opened up this question of meaning. I think many of us here today are watching this program precisely because this question of meaning really matters. And, you know, meaning isn't something you can read off from just looking at the universe. It's about deep reflection. Maybe it's about thinking about the deepest instincts within us.
Was your life lacking in meaning before when you were an atheist?
I think I felt I had meaning, but I felt also it was a meaning I had simply constructed. And the deeper question for me was, is there something there I'm meant to be walking into? Is there something there, a bigger picture of which I could be part? And that seemed to me to be a very important question to ask.
A lot of people point, and we'll come on to this, of course, a lot of people point to certain precepts of religion and they see them as being irrational. I mean, and some people say, how can it be rational to take your religion to accept that we are born sinful, and unless we get better, we're threatened with a hell that the God who made us created? Now, you can see how some people think that is baloney.
Well, I can see why some people would say that, but with respect, I don't think that. And I mean,
many of your faith do.
Exactly, but I think one of the points I'd like to make is that you've got to respect the fact that, for example, a religion like Christianity is a very rich religion. There are different perspectives, and it's very easy to say there's this kind of Christianity. I think it's baloney. Let's get this guy to own up to it. I want to say that Christianity is rich, exciting, enormously intellectually stimulating. Maybe there are forms that there aren't. That's not me.
It's a broad church.
It's a broad church. And I belong to a bit that I think is great.
Yeah, Julian, do you want to come back?
Well, I think that is interesting, and Alice is exactly right, that there are different forms of religion. And so anyone who tries to say that religion is irrational because of X, you're never going to cover all of it. But I do think that sometimes the problem here is that we can have this debate in these very sort of polite ways, and we can talk about how, of course, you don't have to believe in hell and so forth. But when it comes down to it, I do think, as a matter of fact, it is true that the majority of religious people will believe at least one thing, which to an atheist, or to someone who would take a purely scientific view, is kind of outrageous. So in terms of Christianity, for example, bottom line for a lot of people is the resurrection, that they may doubt certain things happened in the Old Testament and this, that and the other, but I've yet to find very few Christians I meet were prepared to say that no, that tomb wasn't empty because there was a resurrection of Christ. Now, that's a very tough thing to believe if you accept a naturalistic sort of scientific worldview, but people do believe it. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but in doing so, they are going against, I think, a scientific worldview in that particular point.
I'll come back in a minute. Vince, you want to come in here? You're on the edge of your seat.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Julian, and I think sometimes there's an assumption that Christianity or belief in God generally is the more extraordinary belief. It's the more miraculous belief, and therefore it has the burden of proof. And I thought that for a long time, and the more I reasoned about it, and I thought, what are the possible big picture explanations for the universe? There are only three primary ones. One might be God made it, and I might just put my hand up and say that's pretty extraordinary, that's remarkable. But if I look at the other two, the universe just popped into existence from nothing with no explanation whatsoever. Okay, that's a very odd option as well. Physical stuff usually doesn't pop in and out of existence. If it doesn't now, why would it have then? Or we say the universe has just existed infinitely, stretching back in time. And that, I think, just pushes the oddness one step back.
Or universes. Or universes. That's number 4.
If it's universe or universes, either way that you understand that. If there's a succession going back infinitely in time, still with no explanation for why that's the case. So I come to the conclusion that we live in a miraculous world, whether you're an atheist, a theist, or an agnostic. I don't think there's any getting around that fact. And once I came to see that, then I think I was more open to seeing that maybe miracles could take place.
But Julian, it's impossible for us to conceptualize that stuff. 13.5 billion years. It's no more likely that we're going to do it than a rat is going to explain what the London Underground is all about,
Well, what's exactly right here is that whatever the truth is, it is extraordinary, and it is extraordinarily hard to fathom. But I don't think anyone should think that the solution they come up with, whether they're theist or atheist, is that the final account. Of course it isn't. For the religious, there are very deep mysteries which they don't understand. Similarly, there are very deep mysteries for the more, say, scientifically inclined people. But again, it goes back to
many religious people are very scientifically inclined.
Some of them are. That's true. A lot of them are.
Some of them are. A lot of them are.
Thank you, Julian. That's the real world. That's the real world.
So the question of which fits which extraordinary explanation the most, and that's where I think the rationality points to the naturalistic one.
We'll come to the science later on because there are some fascinating areas within science for us to discuss. But what about and you touched on this, Julian, the cultural reasons. Different religions in different parts of the world, different cultural histories, different anthropological bases for those. And Dr. Lois Lee, this is quite interesting. Recent studies have shown that societies with a stronger belief in heaven and hell have higher crime rates. Now, this is multifactorial, as they say. But societies with a strong welfare state, a big comfort blanket, lots of security for those who live within, have a lower religious belief. What can we extrapolate, if anything? And my goodness me, it's very complicated.
It is very complicated, Definitely multi-factored. But I think that it gets to, you said, if we leave our religious backgrounds at the door, then we can work with evidence. And that's a really big if. We can't leave our backgrounds at the door. And for most people, what we find is you are religious or you're non-religious according to the norm in your locale. It can be as local as the borough you live in, can be as local as your family, but it also works on the national level. So when we're thinking about rationality and weighing up the evidence and so on, we're putting to one side a big part of the picture, which is this cultural inclination towards one belief or another. And as you said, there's many factors for that. The size of the welfare state is a major factor. The larger the welfare state, the less likely you are to be religious.
The religious history of a country as well, does that come into play? If a country is formally very religious?
Yeah, so you can't, what we can find is a general trend line that the larger the welfare state and how relatively affluent it is can allow us to predict how religious it is or how atheist it is. But then we find that we get pushed in different directions by cultural backgrounds. So state atheism had a big impact, and we saw a big rise in atheism within that cultural context. So we have to consider those cultural factors as well, and not say, because there's a big welfare state, therefore I can say that religion is all about comfort and so on. There isn't going to be any easy explanations like that. But certainly we need to take those into account.
What about Sweden? That's famously cited as an example of quite an atheistic or agnostic or not very religious place. Are they irrational?
The thing is, if you do
or are they
focus,
very rational? I mean, it depends which side of the debate you're on.
It's a good question, because if you do focus exclusively on rationality and these kinds of debates, you end up having to say the Swedish are more rational than the Brits, which you may want to say.
Yeah.
We're 13th highest in terms of the amount of atheism that's from a shorter list of.
So we're either the 13th most rational or the 13th most irrational.
So we have to accept as a country that we're less rational than the French, the Latvians, the Estonians, and so on, and more rational than 27 other countries.
It's like the Eurovision Song Contest. We're never going to win anything, you know. So is there a tipping point perhaps where it becomes, you know, lots of people are saying at the moment they're feeling it's becoming unacceptable to express your religious beliefs, to express your Christianity. Is there a tipping point in some countries whereby it becomes socially more acceptable and expected that you are not a believer? And so that's self-perpetuating in a sense.
No, absolutely, and that's the creation of a new culture in which it's normal to be X or Y. And that's also really important in terms of rational claims, because if people make a rational claim, what you want to see is that they back that up by their action and so on. So you see the kind of transformation of rationality is very informed by these different kind of cultural norms. I think Britain is quite an interesting country because there's quite actually a balance between religious cultures, Christian culture especially, and atheist and non-religious cultures. They're the two, they're sort of both sitting at the 40-50%. So actually it's quite an interesting space for discussion. And the discussion matters because that's what creates the cultures. So the cultures then condition what we're able to think through and take on, and our conversation participates in that. So it's not saying we don't have a very deterministic view and there's no point even having the conversation. But certainly, especially if we get to the stage of saying, so-and-so's being irrational, I think we have to accept that we're all pretty irrational. Accept that as a starting point.
Well, I do this show a lot. That would seem to be. But Professor McGrath, you're a great scientist. Whether that's nothing to do with your religion, you're a great scientist, great academic, highly respected. You know, you're an evolutionary theist. You accept that. You said that Adam and Eve are symbolic, and we'll come on to the science later on. And I'm sure, and you've already hinted at this, you can understand very well how some people point of aspects of religion and aspects of belief and think that is, if you pardon the expression, bonkers. You can understand that. But then the other accusation to you would be that you've moulded religion to fit into your rationality, and that's all you've done.
Well, I think everyone who thinks about these questions, in effect, has to say, do I simply buy into something that's already there? Or do I think this through in a free-thinking way? In other words, this is what I think, this is what I believe to be right. And I think I'd want to affirm the importance of rationality. You've heard that said very, very clearly. But, you know, the real problem we're all facing is that only shallow truths can be proved. And all of us are in a situation where there are deep questions like, what's life all about? Is rape wrong? Should we oppress people? people, where actually the
What
questions...
is right, wrong got to do with
Well, yes,
religion?
these are just questions where we've got to come to answers where pure reason isn't going to give us those answers. And what I'm trying to make is that in many ways we have to realize that we're in a situation where to answer the big questions, we're going to have to go beyond what reason is able to say. And that's not a problem, but it is, I think, an emphasis on the need to try and understand each other and allow these discussions to take place. And I think it's what I think is missing in our cultural context at the moment. I have no quarrel with Julian, who I think is a splendidly warm and generous person. There are other atheists who are just downright nasty, who are trying, in effect, to
religion
ridicule.
doesn't have a clean record.
Of course it doesn't. I'm trying to make the point that actually we all have a situation here where we need to try and have a good conversation. And ridiculing, whether you ridicule faith or non-faith, actually just makes things worse. We need to have an intelligent conversation. I hope that's what we're having now. I think it is.
Well, I hope it is. Ollie, you wanted to come in here. Ollie, by the way, is a former vicar. He ain't a vicar anymore.
Not anymore. Alistair has to be right, that there has to be discussion and there has to be balance and there has to be generosity. But it seems to me that sitting among us, we have a group of rational people with widely different opinions, and those opinions are motivated by something. Now, it seems to me that Hume was onto something when he said that reason can only be the slave of the emotions. It seems to me that religion is about an emotional commitment. And I, for one, had reached the end of intellectual belief long before I could make the actual move out of the church. It took me 20 years to get to the position where emotionally I was ready.
What was the mindset when you were in the church, when you were a believer, when you were a vicar? What was your can you step back?
I wish it was as clear as that, Nicky, but it's not. When I started asking questions about my family's religious beliefs when I was 5 or 6, and the whole thing followed through a theological college and so on. And there were always more questions than there were good answers. There were answers, but often not good enough answers. And I was on the way out intellectually not long after I was ordained. So I have a problem there anyway. Don Cupert and other people were saying that religion is a man-made phenomenon, and nonetheless it's a good thing. And I bought that. And I lived hard with being man-made and also a good thing. And those two don't sit together very well. But it took me 20-odd years to make the break that said, actually, I can now take off this dirty garment and walk away from it.
One second, Adam. I just want, if you don't mind, I want to come to Julian on what Alistair said about the big questions, to address the big questions, the profound questions, like why is rape wrong, or I think that was how you put it. We somehow need to be religious beings.
Well, I don't really need to be religious beings. Obviously, I don't think that. But I think there's
no,
something...
Alistair,
yeah.
I think it's...
No, I didn't make that point. I was simply saying we have to go beyond pure reason.
Yeah,
okay.
Without necessarily being religious. But you may raise religious questions along the way.
I apologise.
Well, it's that term pure reason. I know something you said there. I think it's a very interesting one, an important one, because I do think sometimes people on the atheist side of the debate overstate the extent to which, how far rationality can take us. They think that if you just follow reason and rationality, you can make sense of everything and nothing else is needed. And as Ollie points out, I mean, even people like Hume, who are great philosophers, weren't that optimistic about rationality. But the point about rationality is pushing it as far as you can. It's being as rational as possible, applying as much reason as can be applied to a particular instance. But that is never pure. And anyone who claims that it is onto hiding for nothing. And they are going to be guilty of that accusation, which, well, rationality leaves lots of things undecided. But it's still true, though, that you should always push your rationales and justifications as much as possible with rational inquiry, and you only then have to put the other things in when those things have to fill a gap. You don't bring irrationality in before it's necessary, but sometimes you do have to rely on the non-rational when reason has gone as far as it can.
David Hume, you mentioned, and in fact you mentioned him, Ollie, didn't you? He's one of the greatest of the philosophers on the Enlightenment. It gets mentioned in every single book written by atheists against religion. This quote gets mentioned, and to paraphrase it, he asks, which is more likely, the supernatural explanation or people believing the supernatural explanation are mistaken. He comes up with that all the time, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example. It's not
yeah.
it's not that you can prove one way or the other. You can't prove a miracle did or did not occur.
So it's more likely people are mistaken.
But it's always more likely that they're mistaken than it did actually occur. Now, there are possible circumstances perhaps where, the evidence was so overwhelming, something could happen now in front of the cameras and everything, so miraculous that we had to believe it was a genuine miracle and there wasn't some natural explanation. But Hume thought certainly we hadn't seen anything so far in history which was so convincing that it works.
And I think it's a question worth asking. If something did happen right in front of us that was miraculous, would we believe it were a miracle, or would we explain it away in some way? I think some of us...
Something like what? I mean, it depends what it was.
If we saw a vision of some sort, for instance, some of us would say it was a miracle, some of us might explain it away. So oftentimes it can be a matter of where your emotions are, where your heart is, how we perceive different situations, whether or not we think that a miracle actually did occur. But I do think it's interesting, we talk about miracles. If we're going to say that miracles don't happen, we are speaking against the vast, vast majority of people throughout history and globally still today, which that doesn't prove that miracles do happen. But I do think that we should be wary of being quick to say that the vast, vast, vast majority historically and globally have been wrong.
I think that majorities in this case aren't necessarily always right, but the other thing which is important to say is that once you force a crack in the laws of nature, once you say that for a moment the Earth is not going round the sun, or for a moment relativity doesn't apply, or the gravity doesn't apply, once you say that, then you open up the entire universe to intervention.
And that's the important thing, that there be strong evidence on the other side. If we were on a game show and I didn't know the answer to a question, I might poll the audience. If 98% of the audience said the answer was B, and I went with C anyway, then people would say, you're not being rational, unless I had strong evidence to the contrary that I had access to and others did not. So that would be my question, is what is that strong evidence?
You kind of raised this whole idea of the God of the gaps and intervention, where which we'll come to that in a minute when we discuss science. But I mean, is it rational, in a second, Adam, is it rational, Margaret, for you, entirely rational, to have your belief?
Yes, I think so. To believe in God seems to me entirely rational, because if you will only believe what science has proven, well, whatever discovery is made, the same thing applied the day before it was made. So isn't it irrational to think that, because you can't prove the existence of God, he therefore can't exist?
But which is your God? The God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, which Jesus? I mean,
Jesus, yes. I've been researching a mystic called Julian of Norwich, who lived in the 14th century. Now, Julian had a series, and I've written a book about her, but Julian had a series of visions of the crucifixion. And the image of God that she presents is totally in contrast to what we think of as the Old Testament God, the God who went out smiting every day. But Julian's theology, which is a very benign theology, I mean, she says, for example, that God looks upon us with pity, not with blame. He doesn't condemn us for any wrongdoing, past, present or future. And in fact, all wrongdoing has already been forgiven, even before we go and ask for forgiveness. And
this is from somebody's visions.
Yes, she had a series of visions.
See, this is your point. If somebody had visions like that now, we'd be extremely sceptical, wouldn't we? But anyway, carry on.
Yes, but the thing about Julian is that she's accepted by the church. She's a blessed, which means she's been beatified. So she's on the way to being a saint, but she's not a saint. And she's accepted as a great theologian.
So are we accepting she really did have visions?
Oh, yes. And she wrote a book about it. And she's accepted as a great theologian. And the great Catholic 20th century writer and mystic Thomas Merton describes her as a true theologian in that she has the true image of God, which is this very benign, loving image who never condemns us and is full of only compassionate love for us.
Well, another idea of God. Allow me to move. Satish, there's yet another idea of God. I mean, you're Hindu. And moving on from the visions, yet another. This might even play to what Lois was saying, of different cultures, different cultural reasons, different cultural explanations.
This may even compromise the whole notion of the debate that we're having. But,
give it a go.
I'll give it a go. We have a saying that reason and devotion are two wings of the same bird, and that both of them have a place. We also have an understanding that for some people their aptitude is such that pure rational exploration is what satisfies them and gives them a sense of tranquility. And for others, a divine experience or devoted worship gives them a sense of tranquility. So our approach is that it seems to be that a sense of tranquility gives a person an experience which the mystics have always tried to communicate in some sort of deficient language. And so our focus is on how do we, we're the fundamentalist tranquillists, how do you become eternally tranquil, and what do you have to do? And in that state, there are no beliefs. So I would even suggest that having a belief is unreasonable.
I think that's right, that there's a space for the rational and there's a space that everyone's agreeing beyond the rational.
The numinous, there's something beyond, yeah.
And there's a slightly false dichotomy here between rationality and religion, that we therefore think that atheists are all about rationality, which exactly is what we're trying to say isn't the case. And that so I interview atheists and non-religious people about their sort of day-to-day lives and so on. And so I have a very strong sense of the kind of meaning systems, the aesthetics, the opportunities for devotion, if not the divine, for communion with that sort of tranquility and so on, which again, not every atheist is interested in, as you say. But in the same way, religious people aren't all about those spaces either. There's very, very sort of rationalist religious cultures as well.
But
I think we're setting up a dichotomy here that denies atheists that part of
But if you
their
take
experience.
that reasoning process to its logical conclusion, having a belief in the existence of some God figure, I would say, is equally as irrational as having a belief in the non-existence, because they're both beliefs.
I absolutely agree.
Well, Adam, what do you mean, Adam? I haven't been Adam as you know, people have belief systems, they have mindsets, they have ways of, you know, getting through the night, basically. As a Muslim, though, I mean, you've had a bit of flack recently, haven't you? You took part in a music video, didn't you? Showing...
It wasn't my bad dancing.
Showing... It was the tune Happy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And showing, you know, Muslims being happy and dancing, and then you've had a lot of flack in the past because you've had dogs and so forth.
Yeah.
When people point to things like that, I mean, some people, you know, will absolutely believe that you were wrong to do that, and they're entitled to have that belief. But it's all about the rules and regulations. What sort of God is this?
Yeah, I think many religious people do a disservice to religion, and it can appear to be this kind of dogma of irrational beliefs. I think many religious people are guilty of that, and we have to hold our hands up and say this is a fact. However, that does not represent the actual faith itself. And going back to Ollie's point about believing in God is based on emotion, I think I have to say that that statement is based on emotion. There are volumes and volumes of books. Go to the British Library, the King's College Library, discussing religious philosophy, using philosophy, argument, logic on the side of theism. What we have to sort
There's
of...
books like that on both sides.
Both sides, of course. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying atheism is in an irrational position, but what I would say is that the overwhelming evidence, especially now, is on the side of God. The last 40, 50 years, when scientists examine the universe, we are pretty much convinced that the explanation of the universe is not contained within the universe. It points to outside or beyond the universe. So I think to categorize believing in God as emotional is rather juvenile. It's very outdated. It's very much sort of Enlightenment, outdated claptrap. The reality is...
There's a lot of outdated claptrap in religion, though, which you have acknowledged.
Well, look, I would say this, that we're comparing atheism to the irrationality of religion, let's just say. Let's just say there are aspects of irrational aspects within religion. But that's a false comparison. Even if religion was false, it would not prove that atheism is true. God can still exist even if religion is false. So there is a false comparison in the debate so far. And I would say that if we look at the evidence on the side of God and atheism, the overwhelming evidence is on the side of God.
Julian.
Well, one thing that is about this is the extent to which people who have religious belief actually any onus is on them at all to show their belief is irrational. I think there's an onus to show that your belief is not contrary to what we know about science and so forth. But there's a long tradition in religion of actually thinking the basis of faith is not a deductive argument, it's not a bit of rationality, it's an encounter with the divine, it's an emotional thing. So it's a leap of faith. I mean, doubting Thomas in the Gospels is held up as the counterexample. He's the one who says, no, I'm going to wait, I'm not going to believe, I'm only going to believe when I see the runes. But he's not held up to say, well, that's great, fantastic, you're prioritising rationality. The people who are praised are the ones who make the leap of faith beforehand. So in a sense, I think sometimes there could be too much kind of wanting to claim rationality.
I think that's you're redefining my position. My position is that I believe in God on a rational basis. It's all very well saying that the leap of faith is what really religious people should be involved in, but that's a convenient redefining of my position.
I wasn't talking about your position personally. Actually,
well,
I was talking generally.
Majority of religious people don't believe because they think it's an emotional position. They believe because it genuinely makes sense to believe in God, especially in a world where we're discovering more and more about the universe, the origin of the universe. The fine-tuning of the initial conditions. The
fine-tuning, but people always say we've evolved because of that fine-tuning. So it goes both ways.
Well, evolution wouldn't explain that.
That's what evolution.
There's a negative meaning being put on the word emotion, which actually is a very important part of being human.
Would you say you're an emotional atheist?
I am quite an emotional being, yes,
no,
certainly.
Would you say that your atheism is based on emotions?
No, I said that
why not?
My move was an emotional choice. Now, let's get back to what I'm trying to say, which is this. Let us say you have two professors of biology at our great universities, both of them leading scientists, and one, from what he sees in biology, says that he is convinced that religion cannot be the case, and the other one comes to exactly the opposite conclusion, that the evidence, their reason, each one's individual rationality leads them to their own opinion. And what drives that opinion is the inclinations they were born with, the education they've had, the emotional experiences they've had, and their whole personality.
Ollie, the crux of the argument is this. Shall we believe that the entire universe can come from nothing by nothing?
Let's talk about that, because
that's the crux of the argument.
Let's talk about where the entire universe came from. But Fern, I mean, we've mentioned it earlier on, referred to it earlier on, that this whole idea of that, I mean, you're a great scientist, evolutionary biologist, the God of the gaps. So where there's an apparent gap in scientific knowledge, historically, there's been an explanation, oh, God did it. God did it. And the gaps are, it is said by some people, the habitat is shrinking. I mean, when there's thunder, we know that God is not angry. We know how rainbows are I nearly said are made, but you know what I mean. And so is that a problem for religious people?
I think that the God of the gaps argument is an interesting one, because I actually would say it's probably quite poor theology to revert to a God of the gaps. Because what you're doing is you're inserting a deity into day-to-day phenomena.
And it's a hostage to fortune, isn't it, when science proves, explains something?
I would actually concur with some of the earlier points in terms of the validity of truth claims. I will never be able to stand outside of this universe. I can't think of the size of the budget for a scientific experiment to prove or disprove God. I mean, it certainly beats CERN. So I think we have to recognise that kind of metacausal kind of process, we will potentially never know.
Science will never fill that gap.
Yes, I mean,
we cannot claim that God does not exist then.
But
the reverse of that claim also has to be the one.
Entirely, I entirely agree. Both of our truth claims are equally valid.
But we have on the side of the atheist saying that God doesn't exist.
Let's not all atheists.
We're saying that atheists experience God not existing in the same way that a theist experiences the divine.
Something that's not there.
Julian Bagini. Wait, Julian Bagini.
God, I thought we had irrational.
Julian Bagini. Let's put Julian into the gap here.
I was going to say, actually, Adam's a bit keen to fill the gaps himself, I think.
Some gaps will never be filled. I mean, let's talk about that, first cause as raised by Adam. This is where our brains start to hurt. First cause. What caused it? What caused the cause of the first cause? This is the infinite regress, isn't it? What caused the cause of the first cause? Does that not make you think, hang on a minute, something's going on here?
It's extremely puzzling, but what you come up with, yeah, it's true. What you come up with, though, is an answer which is at a very abstract level, and this is the point, you see. I think that even if, by rationality and reason, you are convinced, which most philosophers aren't, that this means there must be an original, some first caused, uncaused first cause, as it were.
An uncaused first cause.
That gives you a very general concept. But of course, people who are religious do not believe in an abstract concept like that. They believe in a very specific God, which is normally created in the shape of the particular religion, the God of Islam or Christianity or Judaism or whatever it might be. And so, you know, if you are going to sort of like try and build things on reason alone, I think the problem with that is you're going to be left with very, very abstract ideas which don't have a lot of connection with the very kind of richly rounded, often personality-driven gods of religion.
Oh, I'm interested in this uncaused first cause, Alistair. I want to... Can I just... I mean, no proper reputable scientist thinks God was sitting like Walt Disney designing mice. But let's get back to the Big Bang. If you think God was responsible for the Big Bang, is it a credible argument to say, well, was there a cause of the first cause, or was the first cause necessarily uncaused?
Well, of course, these are good questions. But supposing we'd been meeting here a century ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because at that time, science thought the universe has always been here. And one of the things we need to make absolutely clear is science is on a journey. It changes its mind. And these massive, exciting discussions we're having about where the universe came from...
Because it knows more and more and more and more and more.
Exactly. You know, that's a new discussion. And I agree very much what you said about the God of the gaps. I think it's silly, frankly. But I mean, for me, what's much more interesting is why can we explain things at all? Why does science raise these wonderful questions it can't actually answer? And for me, actually, it's not looking at gaps. It's standing back and trying to say, is there a big picture of things which actually makes sense of what we see and fits things in, brings meaning and joy to life? I think that's a much more interesting question. It's not about digging around for gaps. It's rather saying, look, there's a big picture here. Let's try and figure out what it is and whether we're part of it.
But you must, yeah, OK.
Ollie. So well with an experience I had when I was a young clergyman. And somebody asked me outside the church on a Sunday morning why it was that I believed in God. And I trotted out the answer which I had given before, which was, it seems to me that the universe reflects the kind of things which Christianity says are at the basis of everything. The warmth, for example, that Mother Julian talks about. I've read Julian, she's a lovely writer. But then I heard myself say in my head, you know what? That isn't true. The universe is not warm, it is not forgiving, it is not loving, it's a cold, empty, nasty place.
That's a psychological...
in which we could not survive.
A philosophical one.
And that was, for me, was a turning point.
You see, for some people, it's exactly as you would expect it to be had it been a random process from nowhere. From other people, it's exactly as you would expect it to be if there had been a creator. We had some hands, and that's the essence of this conversation. We had some hands up. Yeah, 3 guys at the back. Glasses first of all.
The point was raised that science is changing over time, but also religion is changing as well, but it's never held to the same account that science is. For example, religion was opposed to evolution, and now they're slowly accepting that maybe evolution happened because God was the original cause. And at the moment, some churches preach that we're the only planet with life on it because we're God's chosen people. And I only think that when we discover life on another planet, maybe, religion will change its spots, but it will never be held to the same account that a scientist was held to if he had disagreed with that.
Right beside you, yeah?
I was just going to say the same thing. It becomes an issue.
Are you going to say the same thing as well?
Well, no, develop it on it. It becomes an issue of falsification.
Yeah.
If you say God did it, there's no way that an atheist can disprove you.
Well, Alice is agreeing with you. He doesn't buy that God of the gaps. No, exactly.
Yeah, and then the fact that science keeps developing and the religion is very stoic in its approach. There's no
changes.
Alistair, sorry?
I think religion does change its thinking.
Surely religion has changed to accommodate itself to scientific discovery.
It's not saying that. It's saying, rather, look, let's see if we've got this right. Let's see if we interpret these texts right.
John Paul II, of course, I know it's not your particular credo, I don't think it is, but John Paul II, who has been, he's been canonised, one of the things he did during his papacy was saying, actually, Darwin, right, you know. So, but was that not a case of the church changing because of inescapable evidence?
No. I mean, if you look at Catholic biologists in the last century, if you look at Augustine of Hippo back in 400, he's saying, look, the universe makes most sense if it came to this from in an instant, and then developed over a long period of time. And John Paul II actually also made another point, I think is great for our discussion here today. He was saying, look, maybe science and religion need each other. I mean, science is rightly saying, why do you think that's right? Very good question. Religion's saying, what's the deeper meaning of things? What's our place in it? You know, and these things can go together to give a fully orbed view of things.
Fran.
I just want to come back on the point about evolution and religion being in a kind of clash. We have to be very careful with the history here, because actually it's not as clearly defined as was just typified by that question.
That clash, yeah.
That clash doesn't necessarily exist from the publication of Origin of Species onwards. In fact, as we all know...
It's quite recent, is it?
It is quite recent. It's a product of the 20th century. It's a political and ideological construction. We have to be very, very careful about perpetuating that. I think one of the things we have to recognise is that the majority of people don't necessarily see there being a necessary conflict between science and religion. We have to really, really step away from communicating science and atheism as one thing. And there's a couple of points where we've been doing that today, where we've actually conflated science and atheism together, and they are two very different things.
Good point. Good morning. You've tried Mormonism, right? And you've tried Islam, and now you're trying atheism.
Well,
how's it going?
I'm not really keen on the sort of the personal account type of approach, but I did want to pick up on. I forgot your name.
Me? Mark.
No, the guy.
Sorry.
Professor McGrath. Alistair, yeah.
McGrath's point about meaning in religion. I mean, if we take religion to be a sort of general theory of how the world works, perhaps we could also think that the theories have developed in response to something that's going wrong in the world. And I think this is what is often missed by people like Hitchens and Dawkins, who militant atheists who criticise people for being religious. They don't recognise and understand the great sort of comfort that religion gives to people, the sort of explanations of the world, which I think, is one of the reasons why I'm completely against.
But if it's a consolation, they're at liberty to say, as Christopher Hitchens did, it's a false consolation. That's a perfectly valid argument, isn't it?
Yeah. So, well, one of the things I think the conversation is showing is that there can be reasons on both sides of the debate. Yeah. I think we all agree words like tranquility and peace were used earlier. I think we all can agree those are things to strive for. Those are valuable things. I think from a Christian perspective myself, the place where I find peace is in knowing that you're loved unconditionally by someone who will never forsake you, by someone who would even suffer for you, even give his life for you. And so given that rationally we can think about these questions and say, actually, there are some good arguments on both sides. Yeah. Then I think we do have to ask the question, is it our minds that keep us from, say, belief in God, or is it something else?
Yeah. Father.
I mean,
I have sinned.
Albert Einstein, who I think was introduced to science by a Catholic priest, he was once asked, did he ever think that we would come up with an explanation for the origin of the universe? And he said, no, but when he didn't think it would happen in his lifetime, but he said when the answer was found, it would be two things. It would be beautiful and it would be simple. My faith is not about understanding how the world works or anything like that. I think what I hope my faith is a lifelong exploration of truth and beauty, which I hope is what good science and good philosophy is as well.
And serenity.
That's the product of finding the truth and the beauty. And I find that in the Christian message. And I've got to try and deepen my understanding and faith in that. And the last point I'd want to make about it is faith actually, I just want to say in this context, the context of this argument, certainty in a sense is the opposite of faith. Doubt isn't the opposite of faith, but certainty is. Yeah. And that's where I see a coming together of both faith and reason. It's an exploration. And I think our century, we've become good at throwing stones at each other.
Yeah, we have. We've always been very good at throwing stones. Adam, what's the biggest problem that science poses for religion? If you were an atheist and you were saying, well, science has blown out of the water, what would be the best argument that atheists have?
Against God.
What's the biggest argument against God?
I don't think it would be a scientific argument. I think it would be a philosophical, moral, that is to do with the problem of evil. I think that's the biggest sort of contentions that exist against theism and believing in God.
What about the problem of, it has genuinely just occurred to me, God knows everything that's going to happen, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So if God knows everything that's going to happen, what's the point? What's the point of converting? What's the point of doing? Does that not invalidate free will?
No, there's fallacious reasoning there. Just because God knows something, it doesn't mean God causes you to act. Those are two different logical propositions.
Just to give an example, you know, if I
Does the Christian God know everything that's going to happen?
Yes, I believe so. But if I watch my goddaughter from across the room, oftentimes I can tell, because I know her personality quite well, I know how she's going to act before she does so. Well, if it's true that God knows every hair on our heads, if he knows us so much more than I know my goddaughter, then it's not surprising that he would know how we might act. But that doesn't mean that he's causing it or controlling it.
Julian, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I don't think it's a problem. I think the problem.
You don't think it's a problem?
No, I think the problem of evil is a problem. I think God's foreknowledge isn't a problem because
why isn't God's foreknowledge a problem?
Because you can know if you're God, all that means is you can know what someone will come to do of their own free will. The fact that you can see it in advance doesn't mean that it wasn't their own free will which caused them to act it. So I actually, people often think this is a problem, but I really don't think it is. It wasn't me, unfortunately. So what can I say?
Us together.
I was just coming in on this notion of free will. This isn't just a problem for theological discourse.
Brilliant.
This is a problem for atheist discourse as well. If we take a biological reductionist account of the evolution of human psychology, we risk losing a kind of atheist conception of free will, which obviously ties us back into the kind of the political ideological.
That's when science steps too far, in your opinion. Yeah, out with its remit. Or
if we believe in a naturalistic world and a material world, then the self is lost. All we are is a collection of cells. We lose personal identity. We lose what actually makes us human. And I think that free will does. Well, okay.
Julian. It is overstating it, but what I agree is this: there are challenges. I think there is a kind of strand of kind of overconfident atheism, which thinks that science will lead us to the promised land. But it certainly does raise in questions about our inherent ability to sort of even know the truth, our ability to have free will and so forth. Now, I don't think these things blow it out of the water. They're not unanswerable. I don't think it makes the self an illusion. But there are difficulties there, and I think that an honest atheism needs to accept that the scientific worldview is not entirely comfortable for everything that atheists believe either.
Satish, is the Hindu conception of a greater power, is that more, in your mind, compatible with science?
It's a completely integrated experience. It's of no consolation to me to be convinced that, yes, God exists intellectually. That's of no value to me whatsoever. A belief changes from moment to moment as you learn things. The only consolation, the only thing that would satisfy would be an experience. And the mystics, if you take the mystics out of the picture, the whole God argument becomes just intellectual cogitation. The mystics had experiences, and so our approach is, what do we do to recreate that experience in our own awareness? And the teaching is that when that experience happens, then suddenly there is an expanded connectivity with all of life and with all of creation. And so it becomes a knowing rather than a computational deduction.
Some more hands up. Sorry, Margaret.
Sorry, I just wanted to make
Go
that
on.
little point.
There's some hands in the audience.
Sorry, we've touched a few times on evidence. Well, don't we go a lot on things that we simply know? How do you know that your nearest and dearest love you? How do you know that? It's because you do know it. You can't put that in a test tube, and you can't intellectualize that. You know to a certain extent by the way that they behave towards you, but that's a knowing. That's the point that Satish was making. It's a knowing, and that's what people of faith have. And I don't think it makes any difference whether you're Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian or a Baha'i. It's that knowing, it's that intimacy and that knowledge of God. And that's what we have. And you simply can't intellectualize it. And we could argue all day and it would never make any difference.
Lady there.
I would just like to say, I actually don't believe in miracles. I actually went to Lourdes and I found it ever so depressing, but I do actually have a faith, and I do believe part of having faith is actually believing. You know, I don't believe, with respect, atheism, and so I do feel that faith is very important to me.
Is atheism a belief system as much as any? Is it a Fern? I mean, do we all need to believe something?
I think, I mean, going back to our earlier discussion, I think that, yes, I would argue that atheism is a belief system as much as...
So that's your belief system?
I'm an atheist, a lifelong atheist. I grew up in a scientific household. It's a belief system to me.
Atheism and science are not linked necessarily.
Oh, touché. I mean, I say that because I obviously I work on communicating evolutionary science, so I always have to be quite careful about what I say because people are always concerned about what agendas I might have. The point I'd like to make really about whether or not we need religion is there are a couple of ways we could cut this up. One, we could argue that there is an evolutionary reason for having religious beliefs. There are two ways we could look at it. We could either think that religion is a byproduct of other processes.
As there is an evolutionary reason for love. It's linking, it's bonding, it's having a strong in-group, it's for breeding, it's for security.
It could be a byproduct, and some of what Julian was referring to earlier is seeing religion as an evolutionary byproduct. It could be that it provides us with an adaptive advantage, i.e. being able to work in social groups, having systems of laws and ethical functions. That doesn't tell us anything about whether God exists or not. All it tells us is that there is obviously clearly religion in society in a way that has existed in human hominid society for quite a long time. That's the fact that we deal with.
From when?
Oh, that's a thorny question. You know.
Did the Neanderthals have a God consciousness? Is there any thought, evidence?
There's evidence of early kind of prehistory. Mesopaleolithic, I think, evidence for kind of religious practice in kind of loose inverted commas. We know that clearly it's played a part of human society from early human history and all the way through recorded history. The other thing we know is that it is one of the defining kind of categories of worldview for most people on the planet now. We have to deal with that, whether we're atheists or not atheists. We have to accept that we live in a world of difference. We have to understand that we live in a pluralistic society, and we have to find ways to actually engage with each other in a way that we can communicate in an open dialogue.
Okay,
there were some hands up. Let me take a couple of points from the audience. You said yes. Hello. Wait, your microphone's coming. Microphone's coming. Quick point. Go on.
In relation to the freedom, well, I mean, God, 1400. In Islamic, in the Quran, mentioned that people like the atheists are going to come out and they're going to say things. Let them prove it. So this is being predicted that people will come very clever. They're going to come and they. The other thing, the revelation of the Quran will challenge science. That's in the Quran 1400 years ago.
A lot of that stuff was in ancient Greek philosophy.
The miraculous birth of Christ, who believe in it, and also the Quran is the greatest miracle throughout history. And atheists cannot challenge that because they can't even discuss it in Arabic.
Okay. Game over. Let's all go home. That's the God of the gaps again.
Yeah,
fun.
It is, and I think this is what we need to be very careful about. And certainly in my field of interest around evolutionary theory,
God did it.
We have to recognise that this isn't a conversation about science. This is a conversation about theological debates about literalist interpretations of text. It's nothing to do with the science. I don't have to talk about evidence to do with evolutionary theory because actually you're having a conversation that is intra to your own faith perspective. Other people from your own faith perspective would probably challenge your stance.
Let a quick gentleman there in a jacket just at the edge. I
think the issue is that a lot of the discussion that's taking place is putting God within a sort of a religious group context. In actual fact, like the gentleman over there said, that you don't actually have to belong to a religious group to believe in God. The deist sort of thought system from the Enlightenment didn't necessarily belong to Christianity or Islam or Judaism. It acknowledged the fact that, God is an entity. It doesn't have to be he, she, anything like that. It's an entity. I believe in God, but I'm a Christian, but I see the two as separate. And I think that's a big part of the debate. We need to take the idea of God, away from
I thought
the
you were going to
religious
say I'm a
preconceptions.
Christian, but I don't believe in God. No. Gosh, you C of E people. Honestly,
It's a good point, though, because...
Not being serious. Alistair.
You're making a very good point. I mean,
Yeah.
I believe in God. But I'm not actually a very religious person.
You're not?
No, I'm not. But I believe there's a God. It means a lot to me.
What drives
so
people...
in terms of practices, I'm not really very religious. And I think I'm very concerned that we're simply eliding, bringing together as if they're the same thing, believing in God, religion.
Organised religion.
I think we just need to keep these at some distance. It makes much better discussion.
You've written a very, very good book, if I may say so, about what you believe is a decline in atheism. But we're 13th, is it 13th most atheistic, heathenistic?
Out of 40.
Out of 40 countries in the world. What has and what is driving people, and what does drive people to atheism? Is it the examples of religion that you would describe as extreme?
Let me tell you what I think it is. I think the rise of religious fundamentalism is the biggest driver for atheism in the modern world. And I want to put my hand up and say, maybe I'm contributing to that. Maybe it's part of my thing. And that
You're not a religious fundamentalist.
No, but maybe we need to think very carefully. Maybe religious people need to, in effect, say, maybe we are causing this problem. I think that's a very significant thing. Secondly, I think there's also this question of the cultural authority of science, which we've talked about quite a lot. And I think that scientists do need to make it clear that science is theistically neutral. I don't say it's anti-religion, I don't say it's pro-religion, it's science.
It just is what it is and says what happens.
Absolutely, science is science, it's great. But when it starts behaving as if it has answers on religious things, I mean, it actually damages itself. I think that needs to be said. We need to purify science and rescue it from being used as a weapon by either religious or anti-religious fundamentalists.
Ideologues.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Thomas Huxley made that point years ago. He said science commits suicide when it adopts a creed. And I'm really asking, can we purify science of these ideological elements and get back to what it used to be?
Can you purify religion of these ideological elements which make people say, well, that's ridiculous. The world wasn't created it's not 6,000 years old.
I think the ideological elements in today's religion that most people are worried about is the propensity towards violence. And I think that's a big one we've got to face up to.
Yeah. I just think that my old theology teacher at college started out with something which echoed with what you said, Father. She began her first lecture by saying, if we believe that God is truth, then theology is a journey into truth, and there is therefore no question which cannot be asked, and there is no difficult question which may be ducked. Now, I followed that teaching, and it led me away from the church. She wouldn't like what I've gone to, but she would approve of the method. And that journey into life and truth is the way to go.
Adam, do you think that those extremists of any religious stripe are a genuine threat to those of religions who have, I don't know, mainstream views? I mean, do you think is it a worry for you?
Yeah, I think speaking as a Muslim, I've seen my own faith, Islam, being hijacked by extremists. I don't know if it justifies them, Muslims becoming atheists, but certainly they do contribute them becoming apostates. There is an irrational
abandonment of faith.
Yeah, the abandonment of faith, and in some cases they're justified because what they're actually rejecting is not Islam, but they're rejecting a perverted version of Islam. And so, very much so, I would agree that religious people, extremists, are contributing to anti-religious sentiments and also contributing to becoming sort of atheists. I think, but what I would also say is that what also supports religious fundamentalism is extreme militant atheism. That is also a problem as well. What the encounters that I have reading sort of militant atheists is that...
Well, Adam, you've made a very balanced point. We have to leave it there. Thank you for watching. We will see you next time. And thank you all very much indeed for taking part.
Singing for a place in the final. The School Choir of the Year competition continues on Songs of Praise later at 5. But next on BBC One, it's the Sunday Politics.